Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. Civil Rights 2, Other Protected Minorities. Part 1, Women's Right to Vote. Professor Peterson, we learned that in the 14th and 15th Amendment, the franchise was expanded, notably to include African Americans. Did women get the right to vote at this time as well?
Well, some women at the time thought it should be the case that they have the right to vote. If you look at the 14th Amendment very closely, you'll see it says the right to vote at any election if cannot be denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state, being 21 years of age and a citizen of the United States. So Elizabeth Stanton advocated to strike the word male from the provision, but Congress ignored her request. Since women didn't have the right to vote, they didn't have much political power, and they could be safely ignored. And it was further argued that if you introduce this into the discussion, it's going to complicate getting that amendment passed through Congress, and then the whole question of giving African Americans the right to vote is going to be much more difficult. So because they thought the rights of African Americans were more important than the rights of women at that time, they said no.
Did anyone try to ask the courts for the right of women to vote?
Well, Chris, a lot of people think that when people don't have rights or their voices are politically weak, it's the court who steps in and saves the day. But that didn't happen. In 1873, in Minor v. Happersett, the case does come to the Supreme Court, where Virginia Minor tried to register to vote in Missouri, but she was barred because she was a woman. So she went to court. Of course, it was her husband who had to file the lawsuit because she had no standing in court. And they argued that the denial of the right to vote was a denial of the equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment. But the Supreme Court said no, women can't vote. That was what the Constitution said, and the court saw nothing in the 14th Amendment to change it.
So then, how does this begin to change? How do women finally get the vote?
Well, women get organized, and they start campaigning, and they start trying to persuade people across the country to support it. They don't get much support in the East, but interestingly enough, they get support in the West. So if you look on this map, you'll see that those dark states are the states of the West, and the dates on them are the dates that women win the right to vote even in presidential elections in these states. Now, why do women get the right to vote in the West and not in the East? Well, part of it is just the fact that these are new political entities that are being formed, and it's easier to introduce a new idea into a new place than it is in an old place. But there's more to it than that. Women were valuable assets in the West. The West had been settled primarily by males, and if they were going to be a thriving community that was going to survive over the long run, women had to be attracted to the West. So you could make a very powerful argument that women were such an important economic asset to the West that they had to be given political rights as well. Now, this turns out to have big consequences because when you give women the right to vote in some places and you have presidential elections that include those places, presidential candidates have an incentive to support women's rights more generally. And so you see that gradually over time, in this, as the go down the second column, you see we're moving from 1890 to 1914. And then in the next column, you see the votes in the Electoral College in states where women have the right to vote. So by 1914, women have the right to vote in enough places so that 87 electoral votes are going to be influenced by women. And that's 16% of the total, and that can be decisive in a close election. Well, 1916, you have a Republican candidate for president. He becomes a strong advocate for women's right to vote, to change the Constitution. or even just to pass a federal law. You have a sitting president, Woodrow Wilson, who is supported by the liquor interests who don't want women to vote because they're afraid that prohibition will follow the right to vote. And so Woodrow Wilson hems and haws and says, I think this should be left up to the states to decide. We shouldn't have one rule nationally. Well, Wilson wins anyhow because he is the sitting president and we're in the middle of a war after all. But this is the last time it's an issue. By 1920, we get a new constitutional provision. It sails through Congress, it sails through the states. Women are given the right to vote. Once the tipping point was reached, change happened very fast.
1920 is really a big year. What makes it official?
Well, it's the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of sex. So the surprising thing is that once that amendment's added to the Constitution, the women's movement loses its steam and it doesn't have the same energy that it had before. And that's going to be an interesting idea that we're going to return to later on.
Professor Peterson, how would you sum up some of the key takeaways from our short discussion about how women got the right to vote?
Well, Chris, I think the important thing is to realize that the Supreme Court doesn't give out goodies to people unless they acquire political power. And women owed their success in getting the right to vote not to anything that the courts did, but because economics and politics worked out to their advantage. And there's many parallels to that in the story of African Americans because once they began to move north, they got the right to vote, and that began to change thinking, and that began to change Supreme Court decisions as well.
In the next part, part 2, we'll move on to talk about civil rights of women.